The scorching Mississippi sun bore down on the fields where young Samuel B. Fuller and his siblings worked tirelessly, their hands caked with dirt, their backs bent under the weight of endless toil. Born in 1905 into a family of sharecroppers, Samuel knew the world had already decided his place, but he refused to accept it. He had seen his mother, a woman of quiet strength, manage their meager household with an iron will. Despite the hardships, she instilled in him a belief that would shape his entire life. Poverty is a condition, not a destiny. Samuel watched as white salesmen traveled from home to home, selling products to families who greeted them with smiles and open wallets. He wondered, why couldn't a black man do the same? When he was just a boy, his family lost their farm. Forced to move, they barely had enough food, let alone hope. But Samuel had something stronger than hope: determination. He took whatever odd jobs he could find, saving every penny. By the time he was in his 20s, he had already worked as a street cleaner, a coal shoveler, and even a dishwasher. Yet, his mind was always on something bigger. One day, as he walked through the streets of Chicago, he noticed a man selling soap and household goods door to door. The idea struck him like lightning. Soap. Everyone needed it. It was small, affordable, and essential. He had no capital, no formal education, and no connections, but he had the will to try. Samuel scraped together what little money he had and bought a small stock of soap from a wholesaler. He went door to door, knocking with a bright smile, speaking with confidence, and refusing to take no for an answer. At first, doors slammed in his face. Some white customers scoffed at the idea of buying from a black salesman. Others listened, but refused to hand over their money. It was demoralizing, but he reminded himself, poverty is a condition, not a destiny. Then, one day, an elderly black woman opened her door and listened. She saw something in his eyes, the determination of a man unwilling to accept failure. She bought a bar of soap. That single sale was all he needed. The next day, he sold 5. The week after, 20. Soon, he was making more money in a week than he had in months of hard labor. But Samuel wasn't satisfied. He didn't just want to sell soap. He wanted to own the company that made it. And he would. He just didn't know that the moment he built something great, there were those waiting in the shadows, ready to tear it all down. The bitter Chicago wind howled through the streets as Samuel B. Fuller pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. He had learned to navigate this city with the same determination that had once driven him through the Mississippi fields. Every step forward was a fight, but he was never afraid of a fight. His soap-selling business had grown beyond anything he had imagined. He started hiring others, young black men like himself, hungry for opportunity. He trained them to sell with the same conviction, the same persistence. They weren't just selling soap. They were selling dignity, self-reliance, and a future that wasn't bound by racism or circumstance. But selling another man's product wasn't enough. He wanted control. He wanted ownership. One evening, while sitting in his tiny office space, a room barely large enough to fit his desk, Samuel spread out his notes and crunched the numbers. He had saved enough to take a risk. He had a vision that was bigger than any single product. He would build his own company. With his savings, he purchased a failing cosmetics manufacturer. It wasn't much, a small factory with outdated equipment and a few employees who had lost faith in the business. But Samuel had never been one to accept limits. He renamed it Fuller Products Company and began restructuring everything. Instead of relying on traditional advertising, he built a powerful network of door-to-door salesmen. His workforce grew rapidly, and his sales team, many of whom were black men and women, became an unstoppable force. For the first time, black entrepreneurs had a business they could call their own. By the 1950s, Fuller Products Company was booming. The numbers were staggering. Over 5,000 salesmen worked under his leadership. His revenue skyrocketed to $18 million a year, an unimaginable sum for a black businessman at the time. He expanded beyond soap, introducing a full range of cosmetics, perfumes, and personal care products. His brand was in homes across America, but success came with a price. Samuel had always known that his rise would attract attention, not just from those who admired him, but from those who despised the idea of a black man building an empire. Rumors began circulating in certain circles. White-owned competitors felt threatened. Whispers of putting Fuller in his place began to spread. Then came the first roadblock. Major department stores refused to carry his products. They made excuses, citing company policies or limited shelf space. But Samuel knew the truth. They didn't want a black-owned company competing with them. Still, he adapted. He built his own distribution channels, doubling down on direct sales. His business kept growing, defying the odds. That's when they decided to hit him where it hurt. The White Citizens' Councils, groups of white segregationists who sought to crush black economic progress, began working against him. They organized a nationwide boycott of his products. Samuel's success was no longer just a business matter. It had become a battleground in the fight for black economic independence. He had built an empire. Now he would have to fight to keep it. Samuel B. Fuller had spent his life defying expectations. From the fields of Mississippi to the bustling streets of Chicago, he had proven time and again that hard work and vision could break any barrier. But now, he was facing an enemy that wouldn't just slam a door in his face. They wanted to destroy everything he had built. It started quietly. Some of his longtime customers began canceling their orders. Salesmen, who had been making a steady income, suddenly found themselves struggling to move products. Calls to white-owned distributors went unanswered. Then, the newspapers picked up the story. White Citizens' Councils, powerful groups of segregationists who aimed to maintain racial control over the economy, had declared war on Fuller Products Company. They urged white consumers to stop buying from him. They pressured stores to pull his merchandise from their shelves. They made it clear, a black man had no right to compete with white businesses. Samuel watched as sales plummeted. One evening, he sat in his office, staring at the numbers. His once booming empire was hemorrhaging money. His factory, once buzzing with production, now had machines sitting idle. His workforce of 5,000 was at risk of collapse. He had fought racism before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about the entire future of black entrepreneurship. If they could destroy Fuller Products, they could send a message to every other aspiring black business owner. Don't even try. But Samuel Fuller had never been the kind of man to surrender. He doubled down. If white stores refused to sell his products, then he would sell directly to black consumers. He began organizing community-driven sales events, where people could buy directly from his warehouses. He launched aggressive marketing campaigns in black newspapers and radio stations, urging people to support his company. If we don't build our own businesses, no one will. The words resonated. Black communities rallied behind him, recognizing that Fuller's fight was their fight too. Salesmen worked harder than ever, fueled by a sense of purpose, not just profit. But the White Citizens' Councils weren't done. They had another tactic in mind, one that could cripple him permanently. Banks that had once supported him began calling in their loans early. Credit lines he had relied on for years were suddenly revoked. He was left scrambling to keep his business afloat, forced to liquidate assets just to stay in operation. It was financial warfare, and Samuel knew that if he couldn't turn things around fast, the empire he had built would come crashing down. The weight of the crisis pressed down on Samuel B. Fuller like a storm cloud refusing to break. He had spent years clawing his way to success, only to watch it unravel at the hands of men who despised the very idea of a black business empire. His sales were sinking. His credit had been revoked. His factories were slowing down. And now, his most loyal employees, people who had built their livelihoods around Fuller products, were beginning to worry. One by one, they came to him. "Mr. Fuller, what do we do?" It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a movement, and the movement was under attack. But Samuel had one last card to play. He called a meeting with his top salesmen and distributors. The Fuller Products Company wasn't going down without a fight. "If they don't want us in their stores," he told them, "then we will build our own." With that, Fuller launched an aggressive campaign to expand black-owned distribution. Instead of relying on white-owned retailers, he poured his remaining resources into a network of independent black businesses that would sell his products. He personally visited black neighborhoods, speaking in churches, community centers, and local businesses. His message was clear. We have the power to control our own economy. If we support each other, no one can stop us. The response was overwhelming. Customers who had never considered where their money went before now saw every purchase as a statement of resistance. Sales started climbing again, but it wasn't enough. The financial chokehold the white citizens' councils had placed on Fuller was suffocating. Banks refused to extend loans. Suppliers raised prices on his materials. Even some of his own employees, fearful of what was coming, began looking for other work. And then, the worst blow came. Fuller's creditors called him into a meeting. He had fought off financial ruin for as long as he could, but now they were demanding something he never thought he would have to do. He had to start selling off parts of his empire, his factories, his distribution centers, his assets that had taken decades to build. They wanted them, and they weren't giving him a choice. Samuel sat across from them, his hands folded, his mind racing. Everything he had built was hanging by a thread. Would he give up pieces of his dream to survive? Or would he let it all crumble around him, refusing to bow to a system that was never meant for him to win? Samuel B. Fuller sat in the dimly lit meeting room, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished oak table. Across from him, the creditors sat with their documents, pens poised, ready to strip him of what he had spent his life building. "Mr. Fuller, this is the only way to keep some of your business intact," one of them said. "Sell off your assets, reduce your debt, and you might be able to keep a portion of what you've built." Samuel's jaw tightened. He had fought against forces bigger than these men. He had knocked on thousands of doors, been rejected, and still pushed forward. But this was a different kind of war. It wasn't fought in the streets. It was fought on paper, in cold numbers, in contracts that decided the fate of his empire. He had no choice. With a steady hand, he signed away factories, warehouses, and product lines. The company that had once been the largest black-owned business in America was now a shadow of its former self. When the deal was done, he stepped out into the cold Chicago night. The city, which had once felt full of possibility, now seemed distant, like it had moved on without him. Word spread quickly. The man who had once inspired thousands to become business owners, the man who had preached financial independence, had been forced to sell off his empire. For his employees, it was a devastating blow. Some cried, others cursed the system that had never wanted a black businessman to succeed in the first place. But Fuller refused to show weakness. He gathered his remaining staff and stood before them. "This is not the end," he said, his voice unwavering. "A man is only poor when he gives up on himself, and I am not poor." Though Fuller Products had shrunk, it wasn't dead. He refused to quit. He restructured, pivoted, and found new ways to keep his company running. It would never be the empire it once was, but it would survive. But the battle had taken a toll on him. The betrayal of the banks, the cruelty of the boycott, and the realization that his success had been too much for some people to accept weighed on him. He had built something extraordinary, and they had torn it down, not because it wasn't good enough, but because they couldn't stand who was behind it. Samuel Fuller had lost his kingdom, but he still had his crown, his pride, his integrity, and the belief that the fight for black economic independence wasn't over. And he was right, because while he had been forced to step back, the seeds he planted in thousands of black entrepreneurs had already begun to bloom. His fight would continue. Through them, years passed, and the world changed. But Samuel B. Fuller remained the same, relentless, driven, and unwilling to surrender to fate. His empire had been crippled, but he had refused to vanish. Even after losing much of his business, he continued working. He held on to what remained of Fuller Products Company, still producing soaps, cosmetics, and personal care items. Though the numbers were smaller, the mission had not changed. But his true legacy was not in the company's survival. It was in the people he had inspired. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, black entrepreneurship had begun to rise. Black business owners, some of whom had once been salesmen in Fuller's network, carved out their own paths, built their own companies, and carried forward the dream of financial independence. Some of the most successful black entrepreneurs of the 20th century credited Samuel Fuller as their first example of what was possible. Among them was George E. Johnson, who founded Johnson Products Company, the first black-owned business to be listed on the American Stock Exchange. Even after facing racism, economic sabotage, and betrayal by the financial institutions that had once backed him, Samuel B. Fuller had won, not by keeping his business intact, but by proving that a black businessman could rise to the top, even when the system was built against him. In his later years, he continued to preach the same message he always had. A man is not poor because he doesn't have money. A man is poor if he doesn't have a dream. He had been born in poverty. He had faced rejection, sabotage, and betrayal. But he had never been poor. Samuel B. Fuller passed away in 1988 at the age of 83. His company, though no longer the empire it once was, had survived for over 60 years. His ideas had spread further than he could have imagined. His story, once whispered in small circles of black business owners, became a symbol of resilience, self-reliance, and economic power. And the white citizens' councils? They had faded into history, their power gone, their influence erased. But the name Samuel B. Fuller, that name still echoes in every black entrepreneur who dares to dream beyond the barriers placed in front of them. Because his story was never just about soap. It was about power, ownership, and the fight to control one's own destiny. And that fight would never die.